Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. And now we come to episode 6, first episode on disc 2, Frank the Writer. And after the feeling of the last episode, this is a pick me up, or as I'd like to refer to it, a palate cleanser. Frank the Writer, definitely one of the better episodes of this season, I think, even though I don't think I would ever see them do an episode like this in later seasons, but they might have if they hadn't already done one. As I mentioned, and I believe the review I did of the pilot, the germ of this episode, the initial idea started when they were writing the pilot episode, and there was going to be a small scene of Frank talking with Raymond at the table, at least according to the commentary. And like I said there, they don't mention if that was cut out in the writing process or cut out in filming because it didn't pace the episode correctly. But here it is. We get, from that little germ of an idea, we get a whole episode. And as you could guess from the title, it involves Frank writing. Now, the pre-credit sequence here begins a gimmick that we only ever see in this first season, sadly. It would have been nice for them to break it out again every now and then in later seasons, maybe for a little mid-scene. But I can understand why they wouldn't, because after a while it's going to start to get expensive, especially later on when the show got really popular and the actors started getting more money. It would have been like, how are we going to budget this? Especially when you get 20 plus episodes. But for this first season, it's a nice little thing, and as they mentioned on one of the commentaries, they knew eventually that if the show did go into syndication, it's like, yeah, you just cut that scene out, it has nothing to do with the plot, and it's a nice little one. And in this episode, it's Ray brings home none other than Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, mainly to get him to sign something for Deborah. And Deborah's sleeping on the couch, and Ray's trying to get her to guess who he brought home, but in a way like, who's your favorite baseball player? Michael Jordan, of course, this being the 90s, this was when Michael Jordan was on top of the world. I mean, I didn't really watch basketball that much, even though it was my late grandmother's favorite sport, and she was more a Lakers fan anyway. But even I know who Michael Jordan was, and he was a big pop icon. And just the look on Kareem's face when he hears that, like, really? Like, no, retired, retired. I forget the name she says for the second one, but then played for the Lakers, Wilt Chamberlain. When I heard that one, I'm like, oh, they went there. Just seeing Kareem, and then he takes the book back and says he'll make him dinner. Like, they really got their use out of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar there. Next, he's gonna go try and fly a plane to get out of here that fast. Now, after the credits, we get Frank talking with Ray, saying that the son of a friend of theirs just sold a little anecdote to Reader's Digest. That's $50. He's trying to talk Ray into writing something for Reader's Digest. You know, Ray doesn't. He's like, I already write full time as it is. You want me to write more? Which, on one hand, I can understand. It's like, it's a full time job, even though some people might not consider writing a job. But take it from me, writing is a job, even if you are good at it. Because sometimes you're like, they even go into the difficult thing about writing in a later scene, and I'll hold on to that until then. But it can be stressful, even if you can just go. So Ray not wanting to write. But on the other hand, it's like, if you have free time and it's a day where writing is easy, what's the harm in writing out something else? So I see both sides. But then I also happen to agree with Ray here, where he tells Frank, why don't you do it yourself? And Frank takes that advice to heart, and he's mulling over it. And 3 weeks later, he's in Reader's Digest. In typical Frank fashion, he overblows it, gets copies for everyone to read. And as you would expect from someone who constantly brings up the Korean War, where Frank served with honor, he wrote one for the humor and uniform section, which this joke is chuckle-worthy. I don't know if it would actually make it into an actual Reader's Digest volume, but I could see Frank telling this type of story, and it is pretty funny. And in case you're wondering what the joke is, I have it more or less memorized. During our first week of basic training, our drill sergeant informed us of what he called the Sir Sandwich. Sir, yes, sir, I don't know, sir, and the like. 1 week later, a colonel approached me in the motor pool asking what I was working on. I said, sir, I'm checking the tires, sir, in this Jeep, sir, and sir, checking the oil, sir. The colonel laughed and said, Private, while I appreciate the respect, I didn't order a Serb club sandwich. See, chuckle-worthy. Frank couldn't pull this off by himself. Which is one of those things like, yeah, he does seem like someone who could write, but I think he probably works better just mulling it over and having someone type for him. And of course, Marie is his little typist. Hey, that's what he calls her, a nickname she does not like. And they joke around a little bit with it. And that's her purpose in this episode, just being his little typist. And she even gets her hands dirty with ink from the typewriter, which even modern typewriters, you can still get a little messy when you change the ink on them. Now, since he's now in the digest, the rest of the episode until the end, Frank is a little full of himself. He really thinks he's made it as a writer just because he's in Reader's Digest, even though, technically speaking, any Joe Schmo can get in there. But, we'll let him have his moment. He decides he's going to write a subsequent piece for it, and one of his little bits of inspiration is the twins, Michael and Jeffrey. And in this case, it's Michael, because apparently, for some weird reason, and I don't think this plot point's ever brought up again in a subsequent episode, even though it would have been a nice little arc thing to carry through this season, Michael does not like Robert for some reason, and this is a little bit of drama that they were talking over before Frank came in with the digest. And while they're reading it, he throws his milk at Robert. There's going to be a thing I'll bring up again in a little bit. Well, instead of going with that at the moment, he decides to write a story about Ray using the cover name Roy. Which, of course, Ray's going to play with. It says Roy. Oh, thanks, Dodd. Well, it seems like he drops that story rather quickly because he doesn't really bring up his writing again for the digest after this. You can imagine he still has that story going there. Being Ray's dad, he probably has plenty of stories that from Ray's childhood that make funny Reader's Digest stories. In the initial stages of Frank being full of himself after being published in the digest, he and Ray have a little conversation down in Ray's office, which this heart-to-heart brings up the one aspect that writers have to deal with, no matter what level you're at. It's the blank page. Even if you know where you want to go, sometimes that blank page just stares at you. As Frank puts it, mocks you. And then Ray adds, bothers you. And even now, as a writer, even though I have my associate's degree, just looking at that page sometimes, even though I know what I want to write up here, looking at the page, it's like, how the frick do I word this? And then sometimes you'll just be sitting there typing randomly, like, that doesn't sound right. But then once you get in the mode, you're like, the words are just spewing. And of course, sometimes you get in the zone, and then when you check back later, and like, why the hell did I write it that way? That's such a typo. Of course, with me, that usually happens when I get in the zone and I'm writing at night. Well, cue Frank number 2. Of course, Frank being Frank, he can't leave well enough alone, and he goes and meets with Ray and his other paper writer buddies off camera and starts talking to them about writing. Which, this is a conversation I really would have loved to see, and we just hear about it in exposition, and from the way Ray describes it, it was super embarrassing. He's like, he was talking to us about writing, so fearing my father the freak, I fled before there was a fatality. Which, I love the alliteration there. We don't really see Ray use a lot of his writing skills when he's actually speaking, outside the humor stuff. But so it's nice to see him do there, and the way that Ray Romano plays it off is pretty good. And you can really tell that Ray was really embarrassed by Frank going to talk to his buddies about writing. It makes me wonder what his writing buddies were thinking when they were listening to Frank. Were they probably thinking, listen to this guy? Or were they probably thinking, like, hey, Ray's dad pretty funny. Maybe he should write some stuff. Or, he's funny, but not for us. And, of course, when Frank comes in, he's got a whole slew of stuff. He's got the hat, he's got a jacket, he's even got a tape recorder and some other weird writer stuff, including a pipe. I look forward to his feedback. And it's during this discussion that Ray has with Frank, that Frank hands Ray the crux that leads into the ending of this episode, and that is something he wants him to present his editor, which is Frank Barone's I Was Just Thinking. A little, it's going to be a little column where Frank gives his thoughts on everything. Minute rice, cars, paints. And reading through some of it, it's like, all right, that makes sense. It would probably make more sense on an internet blog nowadays if you think about it than in a paper, but some of it is pretty chuckle-worthy. And it definitely comes across as someone giving his opinions on things, like, the car alarm has replaced the chirp of the cricket. Who knows what will replace the car alarm? And then, of course, I love the smell of a freshly coated paint. I messed it up. It's saying he loves the smell of dried paint in a room as much as the next guy. But at the end of the day, wallpaper is easy to clean. As someone that is in a room with wallpaper, I could say that's pretty accurate. But then again, I don't know the difference. I've only ever had paint on the outside, and that's weathered, so I don't know if it's that much easier. But I can see the gist. Well, Ray sends it to his editor without Frank's name on it. That's a little idea from Deborah there. So shows she knows how to play mediator in a lot of these situations. And we only hear Ray's side of the conversation when his editor calls back, but it's not good. And of course, Ray does not want to tell his dad what the editor said because he wants to protect him, not hurt his feelings. And you could tell from Ray's reaction to his editor, including, was that your car or did it a vein pop? That it's not good. As he tells Frank, his editor said it was embarrassing and it was amateurish. The embarrassing part you can kind of get because, like I said, if it comes across as something you'd more likely see on an internet blog. But it makes me wonder, from a phrasing and verbiage standpoint, how bad must this have been for an editor to say it's amateurish? Because if an editor says it's amateur, like, dang. I mean, I've never had my writing said it was amateurish, but I've gone back and read stuff I've written like years ago and then been a little embarrassed, but that's mainly because like I would not have worded it that way. Then again, I've read stuff in published books and been like, I would not have worded it that way, but that's a little different than looking at your past stuff and thinking that. But it probably comes across more like text talk or verbiage you would use when you're speaking, not actually writing and then having it published in a professional manner. You know, sans fiction where it's supposed to come across as someone's inner monologue or someone talking aloud, and that's a whole other can of worms. And of course, Ray does his best to get Frank to feel better, and he does cheer him up eventually. It's a great scene. It's one of many touching scenes between the two of them. It's not my favorite of them. One of my favorite ones actually is in season 3, and I'll get to that when I get to season 3. But it's a nice little moment. He does cheer Frank up, which leads to the final scene in Tokyo, Japan, where we see this older couple, I'm assuming a couple, reading aloud something from the Reader's Digest. At first, it seems like they might even be reading Frank's humor and uniform section thing, but the moment the old lady says, Roy, you know, Frank published one of his Ray stories. And it's probably that one he was talking about earlier, which was a puberty joke involving Ray, which it makes me wonder, what story was this? Is this one we hear about later in the show? Is this one that is just going to have a prelude and not be known? Because we do find out some interesting stuff about Ray in later episodes, including something involving one of the younger teachers, Lusty Husty, as they call her. It is one of those things you probably never get an answer to due to the loosey-goosey continuity nature of sitcoms, but it's one of those things that's nice to wonder. All in all, this is a pretty good episode. It has a nice little opener that uses pop culture figures. Good plot, nice little tender moment between Ray and Frank, and something I haven't mentioned, there is a nice little scene that continues the Michael and Robert little plot thread, but given the nature of identical twins, they say it's Michael, but it's actually Jeffrey, who has no problem with Robert. That's probably going to be the closest to an end game on that little plot thread that the show would ever have gotten, but it's one of those things got to mention. It would have been nice to have that carry over for a couple more episodes, and it's never really explained why Michael doesn't like Robert all of a sudden. It's one of those things to wonder. And of course, the ending is nice and a little heartfelt. Showed that Frank really did pick himself back up and managed to get another story published in the Reader's Digest. I'm surprised that they dropped it after one episode. It would have been nice just as a little aside to mention it every once in a while, like maybe randomly in another episode. Who has had 15 stories published in Reader's Digest? You're at 15 now, Dad? Just something random like that. But like I said, loosey-goosey nature, continuity-wise, when it comes to sitcoms.